Good evening. So for the last week or so, we have had a lot of discussions that segued off of the Nazir into Korbanos. We started around Daf Chaf Dalid or so. On Chaf Dalid, actually on Daf Chaf Hey, on Daf 25, the Gemara started going into depth about various korbanos that the Nazir brings, because the previous Mishnah on page 24 on Daf Chav Dalid was discussing about a woman who became a Nazir. Her husband didn't like it one bit, but the problem is that she already separated korbanos. So the Gemara goes into long details about how do we deal with these korbanos that are now ineffective, because when the husband annulled her Nazirus, she wasn't a Nazir anymore. So now you have all these animals that are quote unquote holy and are running around. So the Mishnah had discussed various ways how to deal with them. Either if they were real animals or if they were just money that was set aside for the animals, right? The Mishnah made a difference. And the Gemara on Daf Chafei said there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai regarding a pile of money, okay, that wasn't set aside into separate envelopes for the particular korbanos. Now we know the korbanos is a chatas, an ola, and a shlomim, right? Those are the three korbanos that a Nazir tahor brings. Okay, a Nazir tameh brings a chatas and an asham, and I believe a chatas, an ola, and an asham instead of the shlomim, right? So what happened was that because this woman is not a Nazira anymore, this money that she set aside has to go somewhere. So the Gemara said that even though a chatas money that has no purpose anymore, right? Chatas is always the most stringent of the korbanos. So if you have a case where the chatas money has nowhere to go because she doesn't need a korban anymore, right? Because she's not a Nazira. So what happens to the money? So there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that the money gets mixed with the other monies for the ola money and for the shlama money, and it all goes to a nedava. A nedava, which literally means a donation, it gets used eventually in the Beis HaMikdash. There was a large charity box that they would put money in. And on the off days, when everybody's away, summer vacation, they would distribute the money to buy animals, and they would put the animals on the Mizbeach. It wasn't a nice thing to have the Beis HaMikdash, in slow season. So they pumped up the Mizbeach with Korbanos to be bought all the time to make it look good. Okay? So from that Gemara, the next 5 or 6 pages go straight and talk about all various kinds of korbanos. So we get a little bit lost segueing from Nazir, and we talk about korbanos. And being that I don't believe since we started this class almost 2 years ago, we've had such extensive discussions about korbanos, so I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit about the origin of korbanos, of sacrifices, and why is it that we spend so much time talking about it? Right? We obviously know that it doesn't apply today, and yet the Gemara, I'd say, I don't know, maybe 10-15% of all of Shas discusses korbanos, right? There's a whole Seder Kudshim, which takes about a year and change to do in the Daf Yomi cycle. Non-stop korbanos. So let's just do a little basics about how we got here and where korbanos come from. And if you don't have to look any further than the very, very opening to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, the Shulchan Aruch on page 1, right? The very, very first page of the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim discusses what do you do when you wake up in the morning? Right? A famous line says you have to wake up like a lion, right? Most people wake up like lions, right? Probably not, but nevertheless, you still have to do it. So the Shulchan Aruch goes through what the start of your day should be, and literally out of nowhere, not even discussing the various prayers that we say, it says that you should say Tikkun Chatzos in the middle of the night if you know how to do that. It talks about you should think about the Beis Hamikdash. Then all of a sudden, right in the middle of that paragraph, the Shulchan Aruch says, Tov Lomar Parshas HaKeda, Parshas Haman, Vaseres HaDibros, Parshas Ola, Umincho, Shlamim B'chatas V'asher. So out of nowhere, the Shulchan Aruch is telling us what we should be davening. Now, this isn't per se the laws of davening. This is just laws of getting up in the morning. So out of nowhere, the Shulchan Aruch goes out of its way to tell us, here's what you should be doing, by the way, in the morning. And what does it talk about? It doesn't talk about Shema. It doesn't talk about Baruch Sha'amar or Ashrei or Shmona Esrei. That's real prayers, right, that we say in the morning. Rather, the Shulchan Aruch seems to be focused on talking about the Ola and the Mincha and the Shlamim and the Chatas and the Asham. And then later on, the next sif, it says, Parshios HaKarbanos Lo Yomer Ela B'Yom, right? We say sacrifices only in the morning, right? We don't say it at night. Why? Because we didn't bring sacrifices at night, right? And then the Shulchan Aruch goes on to say further, it says, when you finish Kishe Yisayim Parshas HaOla, after you read the Parshas HaOla, which happens to be the very beginning of Vayikra, right? Parshas Vayikra is where the Korbanos start. It talks about, the first parak talks about the Ola, the second parak talks about the Mincha, the third parak talks about a Chatas, fourth parak talks about a Shlomim, I think, and then the fifth parak talks about an Asham. So it's very, very ordered in terms of how Parshas Vayikra starts. So the Shulchan Aruch is telling you, when you finish saying the psukim that relate to the Korban Ola in the beginning of Parshas Vayikra, you should say the following blessing: Yehi Ratzon B'fanachas Sheyeh Zeh Chashuv V'Makubal Ki'ilu Ikrafti Ola V'kach Yomar Racha Parshas HaMincha V'Hashlamim. Right, and the Shulchan Aruch goes on and talking about Korbanos. Now, most of us probably don't say Korbanos, depending on if you're Ashkenaz or Sfard. Depending on what time you get to shul, most of us miss, a lot in the beginning, and Korbanos is certainly something that is sacrificed, no pun intended. I actually did intend that, so I will say that. And it's just something that we don't really focus on, but here it is in the very, very first page in what to do in the morning. So I find that extremely interesting. And that begs the question, so why exactly are Korbanos so important? So there's a very famous Gemara found in two places. One is at the end of Tainus, and one is at the end of Maseches Megillah. So the Gemara talks about the concept that we don't really have anymore. It's called Mamados, where people would say prayers every day related to certain days of the week. So the Gemara, I am in Megillah, if you're following at home, I am in Megillah, daf 30, page 31b, Megillah Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. This is right all the way at the end of Maseches Megillah. It's a very short Masechta. So the end of it talks about the various things that we lane on Shabbos and on Yontif and during the week and Rosh Chodesh. So here, the Gemara brings down a very famous pasuk that is recited by Avraham during the Bris Ben HaBesarim, okay, where Avraham is basically getting to know God, so to speak. And the question that we all know Avraham asks is the famous question of Bameh Eda Ki Irashena, right? So the Gemara wants to talk about what exactly was Avraham referring to when he asked God in Parshas Lech Lecha, right? How will I know, right? Or how can I be so sure that I'll inherit? Right? Again, he's told that you're going to have a son and Yitzchak, and you're going to be the father of a new nation, right? So the Gemara says the following: Megillah Lamed Aleph, Amar Avram Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribona Shalom, Shema Chas V'Shalom Yisrael Chotim Lefanecha V'ata Oslehem Kedor HaMabul Kedor HaFlaga. So what was bothering Avraham? So you could say, well, what was bothering him is he wanted to know how he's, the guy's 90, right? He's pushing 90, right? Actually 99 in this case, right? And that's not exactly the age to have, right, to have children. So something else was in Abraham's mind, not what we think. Gemara says, what was in Abraham's mind? Maybe, chas v'shalom, the Jewish people that you say that are going to come out of me will one day sin. And what are you going to do? Well, look back in history, a few generations, the Dor HaMabul. He says, how do I know that we're going to have this great nation come out of me? We're all going to be happy. They're going to sin again for a second time in history, and you're going to wipe them out. So that's what Abraham wants to know. So Amar Lo Lav. God said to him, I won't do that. So now the pasuk fits in. Amar Lafanav, the Gemara continues, Ribona Shalom, Bameh Eda. Hey, how exactly am I going to know this? What's the proof? Prove to me that it's possible for the Jews to sin, right? We're not malachim. So where's my guarantee that we're not going to be wiped out like we were back in Noah? So Amar Lo, Hashem said, Kachali egla mishuleshes, take a certain, right, take an egla, take this baby calf and split it up, which symbolizes already korbanos. So Avraham already is doing something with animals. So Amar Lefanav Ribona Shalom, Teinach Bizman Shebigdash Kayim. So Avraham says, okay, so I get this concept of korbanos, but according to what I understand, korbanos only work when there's a Beis HaMikdash to talk about. Bizman Shein Beis HaMikdash Kayim Mati Alehem. What's going to happen, right? So there's no Beis HaMikdash, obviously, in the days of Avram. Avram is worried about even after the Beis HaMikdash, which didn't even exist yet, right? He says, what's going to happen after the Beis HaMikdash, right? They're talking about like really, really into the future. What's going to happen when there's no Beis HaMikdash and there's no Korbanos? Amar Lo, Hashem said, Kfar tikanti lahem seder Korbanos. I already established the order of Korbanos. Kozman shekorin bahen, as long as the Jewish people read the Korbanos, ma'aleh ani alehem ki ilu makrivin lefanai korban. Whoa, he says, I got a simple cure. You know what you do? You don't have to go, you don't have to get the animal, you don't have to get a knife, you don't have to get all dirty or bloody. Simply read the Korbanos. And it's as though they are sacrificing it. Umochel ani al kol vanosam. And just reading it alone, that will be the cure. That will be the mechila, in case you're worried, Avraham, that this nation is not going to continue because we're going to be wiped out, because we're going to have no korbanos to protect us. No, he says, just read it every morning in shul. Fascinating, right? Fascinating. So we already see that way back when, in the times of Avraham, this was something, right? This was something that was already predetermined, and we have an answer for the Beis HaMikdash and even post Beis HaMikdash. I want to read. It's a little timely because the part of the Sefer HaChinuch, okay, that discusses the Korbanos happens to be this week's parsha, right? Vasuli Migdash v'shachanti b'tocham happens to be mitzvah number 95, okay, in the 613. And this is where the Sefer HaChinuch talks about, obviously, what the Beis HaMikdash is, what's the purpose, this is God's house, right? This is the place you go to, right? And he says, by the way, I'm going to let you in on the secret of what the whole purpose of Korbanos is all about. So let's read together from Sefer Chinuch, if you have it. It is mitzvah number 95. I'm going to start in the middle. I'm about a third of the way down. It's a very, very long chinuch. And he's going to tell you the following. V'hinachta hatam hazeh b'inyan habayis, techayev otanu gam ken l'samech al hatam hazeh ba'atzmo, l'fi hapshat inyan hakorbanos. He says, now that I just got finished with telling you I'm not going to go back what he says about the reason why we have a Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, but he says, now that I told you how important it is, right? So now I'm going to tell you the reason, Inyan HaKarbanos, V'shevet Avdo, I'm going to tell you all about the reasons why we have Karbanos and about the people who have to sacrifice and the Kalim Yakarim Yeduin and the vessels, right? And all of the stuff that's related to the Beis HaMikdash. He says, Halo Amarnu ki ikare halavavos tuluyin achar ha'pa'ula. He said, it's the most famous saying that the Sefer HaChinuch, if you've ever learned, always says. He says, ki ikre halavavos tuluyin achar ha'pa'ulos, which basically means that a person's our desires of the heart, right, follow after our actions. Meaning we're led by our actions, and that influences us inside. So he says, if that's true, alken kiyechta ish, when a person sins, lo yitar libo yafe b'davar svasayim levad. He says when a person sins, right, he's not going to be purified. He's not going to be made whole with just words of his sfasayim, of his lips, right? That can't be the case. Sheyomar beini ulokotel chatasi lo asifot. So what's he going to say? He's going to say between himself and the wall, oh, I sinned and I won't do it again. Like that we call confession, right? The church has that. You go in, you do whatever you want. You go to the priest and you tell him for 3 minutes what you did. And the Catholic religion believes that you're absolved of all your sins by getting it off your chest. Our bar is a little bit higher because to the Sefer Chinuch, that really doesn't make sense, right? Because your heart, again, you did the action, now you feel guilty inside. So how do you remove the guilt? You just can't do it just by mumbling some words to someone, right, under a curtain. That doesn't make you, it's venting a little bit, it relieves some of the stress, but that's not enough to help you not sin again, because all you have to do is do confession again. So there has to be something deeper, says the Chinuch, to somehow purify you. So therefore the Chinuch says this is what you have to do. But when you do something gadol, large, because of your sin, he says, you know what you do? You take your goats, right, that are in your yard, right, and you schlep it all the way to Yerushalayim, and everybody sees you. Like, why else are you going to Yerushalayim with an animal, right? It's a little bit embarrassing, right? Again, you're not under a curtain, right, facing someone saying, I sinned. Here, this is a great act. You're schlepping your goat all the way to Yerushalayim, bringing it to the Kohen, and you're doing it, and you're doing all of these various tasks, Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrik, you're doing all these things that most of us don't even understand, right? Thank God the Kohen probably understood it, right? And after you're doing all those procedures about the Korbanos, you're doing this great action. He says the words, V'chol ha'maisa ha'kasav b'karbanai ha'chotim mitoch kach ha'maisa ha'gadol hu yikava b'nafsho, that fixes himself in his soul. He says that would fix all of the evil in his soul, and hopefully that will avoid him sinning again. So in the words of the Chinuch, it's basically, we got to do something to prevent him from sinning again. So hopefully bringing the Korban, schlepping it, don't forget it costs money. So all of these things hopefully will be a preventative measure. Then he quotes the Ramban that we're going to see inside very soon. And he says just a little bit more. He says, V'od nosaf dvarim al tzad hapshat. He says there are other things based on the simple meaning. V'nemar ki mizeh hashorish tzivanu ha'el lahakriv la'olam mehadvarim shalev b'nei adam chomed mehen. Right? That it's from the root of this commandment that we're to sacrifice from things, right, that our heart wants. Like, for example, kamo habasar v'hayayin v'hapas, right? Wine and meat and bread, kadei sheyisor halev yoser ima esek behen, so that the heart is more aroused with this matter. And even a poor person has to bring his little flour that he has, because to him that's a big deal, right? It's all relative to what you have, right? Depending on your bracket, right? That's how much you have to bring. He says, because the truth is, there's a lot of similarity between a human and an animal. Our bodies are similar. What's the only difference? Man, humankind has intellect as opposed to animals. And when we sin, we quote unquote lose our minds. So what are we like? We're like animals, right? We lost our mind. We've sunken to that level below us of animal. So he's expounding a little bit on the Ramban that we're going to see soon. That's why you have to take meat. You have to take an animal similar to us, to bring it and to burn it. And he goes on and on to say, like an ola, you have to burn the whole thing up, right? So that you shouldn't remember it. Just to show that we completely lost our mind. That's the only reason why we sinned. It goes on and on and on. And that's in his reason. And he just ends off a little bit. He says, don't have a problem with this because we've been talking about sinning the whole time. Now we know, like, for example, from a Nazir, that there's a Korban Ola, right? We learned last week that an Ola is called a Daron, it's called a present. So this is all understandable for sinning. But what if you just make a donation? Why are you bringing an animal? What about that whole speech about how you should view it like it's yourself, right? So he says that doesn't make sense. But what he does say is, don't let it be a question, right? Now that I've explained the reason, well, this doesn't apply to a voluntary korban. He says, no, our reason also explains a nedava. Now that we said that this korban is an illustration, is a embodiment of the lowering of ourselves and the elevation of our nefesh, so even, right, even without a sin, the person bringing the sacrifice can also benefit a lesson from this. It's not only for someone who sins, it's in general. You want to bring an adava, it's like a reminder. It's a reminder that our bodies are lowered and our soul raises. So that's a very beautiful reason brought down by the Sefer HaChinuch. Now we're going to get to probably the most famous opinion out of all the opinions, is found in Parshas Vayikra, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Tes. So here we have the Ramban, because the Ramban comments on the very first time that the word Reach Nichoach, right? The Torah actually says, well, what are you doing? So at the end of the Parshas Ola, it says on Vayikra Perek Aleph Pasuk Tes, V'kirbo Cha'av Yerchatz B'mayim, V'ktira Kohenes HaKol HaMizbecha, Ola Ishe Reach Nichoach LaHashem. So says the Ramban, V'hinei b'kasuv hazeh ta'am hakorbanos shehan ishe reach nichoach laHashem. So the reason, right, it sounds like the reason you're creating this korban is to make some kind of reach nichoach, right? In English, that's like a pleasant smell, a pleasant odor that's brought up to Hashem. So now the Ramban, as respectful, he starts to quote the famous Rambam, that this is basically Korbanos 101 in school, everyone learns. This is it. We're going to see it in writing. The machlokus between the Ramban and the Rambam, what Korbanos are all about. So he quotes the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, the famous Guide to the Perplexed, Kitam HaKorbanos Ba'avur Sha'amitzrim Ba'akastim Asher Hayu Yisrael Garim V'Toshavim Ba'artzim Ma'ola. Well, historically, right, this is the Rambam goes. He starts with the word historically. We know where the Jews, where they were. So the nations around them were all pagan nations. And to them, that's all they did was sacrifice to their gods. They brought korbanos all the time. Hayu ovdim labakar uletzon. Okay, cattle and sheep. Ki mitzrim ovdim letleh. The god of the Mitzrim was the Tleh, which is of course related to the Korban Pesach, which is why we tie it up to the bed. The Hakasdim ovdim l'shedim, and the Kasdim, right, were Kasdim in English are the Chaldeans, right? They would worship the Shedim, the demons. Asher yir lehem b'dmus seirim, which is a seir, okay. Like we have the Seir La Hashem and the Seir La Azazel, right? The goat. So they had their goat. That was the Seir. That was their god. Vanshe Hodu, and the Rambam quotes the people of India. Ad hayom le'yishchatu bakar la'olam. Right. This is common knowledge, right? The term holy cow, right, came from right that the fact that they didn't slaughter cows because they were holy to the people of India, right? So we see three kinds of animals that were made holy by the Gentiles, by the non-Jews. Says the Rambam, well, now I understand why we bring these three types of korbanos. What's holy to others, for their avodah zarah, we're going to use it for ourselves for a davar shebekdusha. It's the exact opposite, right? He says what they use for their God, we're going to use for our God. But obviously their God is an Aveira, right? It's avodah zarah. So we're going to take the treif and we're going to make it glad kosher. And that is going to be the essence of our kapara. Kiken yisrafu ha-umnos haros shehen madvei nefesh ki kol kol madveh v'chol choli lo yisrapa ki im bahovcho. Right? You have to take something that's antithetical. Right? What do they call that today? With the flu virus, right? They take the virus, they use what's bad, they turn it into good. Right? That's exactly how they would cure you. Right? So right, when you get the vaccine, they take the strain of it, they give it to you, and bam, it turns into something positive. That's exactly the way the Rambam describes our whole methodology of korbanos, is taking the bad that the non-Jews use and turning it into good. And he goes on, and the Ramban, in a very, very long essay over here, we're not going to read everything, but basically says this whole thing is absolute nonsense. He says the word "vehenehem divrei havai." He says this is complete nonsense. Yurafu shever gadol v'kush yaraba. I'm just going to read it in English for time's sake. These words are mere expressions, healing casually a severe wound and a great difficulty. Right? He says you're explaining it, but you're getting everything wrong. He says. He makes it sound like the korbanos were intended only to remove false beliefs from the hearts of the wicked and fools of the world, when the Torah says that they are the food of the offering made by fire for a pleasing odor. Meaning, if it's a reach nichoach, that doesn't sound like the Rambam. He says, moreover, if the korbanos were meant to eliminate the foolish ideas of the Egyptians, their disease would not thereby be cured. On the contrary, it would increase the cause of sorrow, for since the intention of the above-mentioned wicked ones was to worship the constellations of the sheep and the ox, which according to their opinion possess certain powers, and which is why they abstain from eating them in deference to their power and strength, then if these species are slaughtered to the revered name, it is a mark of respect and honor. He says it's the opposite. You're giving, by the Jews bringing the Korbanos, you're giving respect to the Mitzrayim and the Kasdim. And he goes on and on and on. And he says that nothing over here makes any sense. And then he even proves it from Noah, right? Remember when Noah came out of the Teva with his sons and his family? He said there weren't Egyptians and there weren't any Kasdim yet. So what are they bringing Korbanos for? Right? It doesn't make sense. So how do you answer that? All right, he goes on and on and on. So basically his punchline, the Ramban's punchline, he says it's far more fitting to accept the reason of the offerings, which scholars say that since man's deeds are accomplished through thought, speech, and action. Okay? Machshava, dibur, and maisa. Therefore, God commanded that when man sins and brings an offering, he should lay his hands upon it to contrast the evil deed committed. Everything is like a midah keneged midah. We do to the animal what we did ourselves in a sin. He should confess his sin verbally in contrast to his evil speech, and he should burn the inwards and the kidneys in fire because they are the instruments of thought and desire in the human being. He should burn the legs of the offering since they correspond to the hands and feet of the person, which do all his work. He should sprinkle the blood upon the mizbeach, which is analogous to the blood in his body. See where the Ramban is going? It's all what we have to look at ourselves as that we are the korban, that we should be up there burning. But we have something in our place. All these acts are performed in order that when they are done, a person should realize he has sinned against his God with his body and his soul, and that his blood should really be spilled and his body burned, were it not for the loving kindness of Hashem, who took him as a substitute and a ransom, sacrifice. All right, he goes on and on to discuss it. Then he talks about a Kabbalah, reason from the Kabbalah. We certainly won't talk about that. But as you could see, this is the famous Ramban. And it's interesting, the Rabbeinu Bachai, I'll read just a little bit of it. He says pretty much the same thing as the Ramban. He says, we're directed into three things. He basically reiterates what the Ramban says, that everything we do to the korban is symbolic, what we really should be doing to ourselves. So this is all halachic. I wanted to bring a slight agadic note. I found a really beautiful Kli Yakar, right? Kli Yakar, as you know, is one of my favorites. So when it comes to Korbanos, the pasuk says, Adam ki yakriv miken korban laHashem, right? So it starts off by saying Adam, then which is a single person. Then it says ki yakriv mikem korban, plural, goes from single to plural. So he brings down what Rashi says in Parshas Vayikra, that he says that two people could bring an ola in a partnership, right? He says, Melamed Shabeis Misnad min ola b'shutfas eno maspik liyeshav hamikra lachaver merosh l'sofa ki lo yadanu mehechan hapasuk ha'inyan. I'll just start in the middle. He says over here, Shelo yikashlu b'beis dvarim asher hem nichlu kain v'hevel. The reason why the Torah speaks in plural, he says, because the Torah is warning us to not succumb to who was the first person to bring a korban in the history of the world? You got to go all the way back to the beginning, right? Cain and Hevel. So he says, do not succumb to their issues, right? Because they were nichshal. Shahayu rishonim bahar karvas korban. They were the first to bring to have this idea of bringing a korban. Says the Kli Yakar, ki kayin nichshal b'meh shehevi min apachos v'hagarua. Who remembers the story? Yes, very good. Adam did bring a shor, but that went smooth, right? The fighting, so to speak, between Cain and Hevel was all about what? It was all about jealousy. Now, what was the problem with Cain's korban? Cain at least bought a korban first, but his was cheap, right? V'huzera pishtan. It was nothing. It was flax. It was nothing. Ah, so he invokes the Ramban over here. He says, you want to bring a korban? What are you bringing? Flax. That's nothing. You got to bring a real animal in a tumura for your body, and right, in a swap for your own nefesh, right? Like the Ramban in the Rabbeinu Bachai. He says, and if you're wondering why is it that the poor person in the Chumash, depending on your economic level, you could bring a mincha, you could bring flour, which is far less expensive than an animal, that's only because the guy has nothing left. So God, bedochak, right, barely lets the ani bring a mincha, she'ein ba nefesh, umalav kilu hikriv nafsho. But when he does bring it, it's as though he sacrificed himself, right? So that's Cain. So Cain's problem was, yes, he did volunteer a korban, but he was cheap about it. What about Hevel's problem? Hevel had the opposite problem. The Hevel, afal pi shehevi miploros sono, so Hevel was magnanimous. He brought, right, he went Rolls Royce style. He brought the best korban. Mikol makom lo tova says shalonis orer el korban ma'atzmo. But why did he bring it? He brought it because he saw his brother bring one first. So he says, uh-oh, I better bring one myself. That doesn't look good, right? So because he brought it not through his own volition, lo nizdar is mitzvah zu ma'atzmo. He doesn't get credit for doing it himself. Rak achar shara shehikriv kayin korban aniskana bo hevel. So then he became jealous. He says, oh, I got to bring one also. Hevi gamhu lahashvos atzmo elav. So it was a great korban. Problem was, it wasn't lishma. So both of them had a problem. Cain was too cheap. Hevel had jealousy. So that's why that's alluded to in this pasuk that speaks lashon rabim, that says in plural of Adam ki akriv mikem, right, from you. The Kli Yakar says is referring to, don't slip up like the first two who brought the korban was. So I thought that was a very beautiful way to end this topic of korbanos. There's obviously much, much, much more. And as you know from the last week in Nazir, it goes on and on and on. And all these very, very difficult concepts. We didn't even do Zvachim yet, and Menachos. This is just a teaser, but you could see how great and never ending these chapters of Korbanos are. But I thought I'd give just a little sprinkling as to why is it that we spend so much time talking about it. Very, very good. So now we're going to skip. We're going to change topics a little bit. And for the second half, or second third, we're going to discuss a little bit the inyan of chinuch. Right? Today's daf is daf Chavtes, at least in New York. The Mishnah previous to daf Chavtes and daf Chavches on the bottom talks about a case. Here we are, 28b, about 2/3 of the way down. If you have a Gemara at home, Ha'ish madir as beno benazir, vein ha'isha maderis as beno benazir. So here you have a case where we've been talking the whole time for the last month. The person says Hareini Nazir, and he becomes a Nazir. So now we have this interesting law that for a son, for a boy, okay, to accept Nazirus, the father could accept it on the son's behalf. Very interesting. Meaning, the way Tosfos learns is that he says, Yehei b'ni Nazir, right? He either says one of two things, Tosfos says. He either says, Yehei b'ni Nazir, or he instructs his son to say Hareini Nazir. Either way, he's acting like a shliach a little bit, or he's actually telling his son to become a Nazir, so it actually works. But the Mishnah says, Ve'ein ha'isha maderis es bena benazir. It doesn't work by a woman. A woman cannot play this trick at home with her son and have the son become a Nazir through his mother. And the Gemara and the Mishnah goes on to say, so now, once the son becomes a Nazir and something happened, let's say the family didn't want it. So he has Korbanos already. So if he had a Korban already, we have the same problem that we had in the last Mishnah of what do you do with Korbanos that are no good anymore simply because he's not a Nazir, right? Last time, the woman had it annulled by her husband. Here, he's not a Nazir anymore because, let's say, the people who are living in the house didn't want the boy to become a Nazir, right? They thought it was abuse, right, to abstain from wine. And they shaved him at night when he was sleeping. So now he's not a Nazir anymore, right? But he had these animals. So the Mishnah discusses what to do with them, very similar to what we had last week. So let's skip down to the beginning of the Gemara, third line from the bottom. Ish in aval ish alo. So the Mishnah says, well, it works this way for a father, but not a mother. So the Gemara wants to know why not. My time, Rav Yochanan Amar halachi ben Nazir. So Rav Yochanan, just like he said last week, we have a halacha l'moshe Sinai, and if you'll notice by doing Nazir already for a few weeks, we have a lot of halacha l'moshe Sinai's by Nazir, things that we don't know the reason to, we call them a halacha l'moshe Sinai. So that's one reason. And of course, once you have a halacha l'moshe Sinai, you can't really ask questions because that's just the way the tradition is. Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina Amar, if you skip to 29a on top, Amar Reish Lakish, he says, and Emar Reish Lakish kedei lachancho b'mitzvos. Whoa, he said, there's something going on over here. This is not a halacha l'moshe Sinai. You know why this trick works? That the father could accept something on behalf of a son who may not necessarily volunteer for this, right? It says it works through chinuch. Chinuch what? To be mechanech them with mitzvahs. The boy is 10, 11, 12, he's not bar mitzvah yet. Nazir is a kind of a mitzvah, right? Now, it's not the best mitzvah, which we're going to talk about in a second, but nevertheless, it's a mitzvah. So chinuch, just like you do things for your son a couple of years before the bar mitzvah, you learn with him, you buy him tefillin. When he's not bar mitzvah yet, you buy him maybe an esrog, right? So this is an example of chinuch. So chinuch is, so the Gemara says, that's great because of chinuch, but what about a mother? What, so you're telling me that a mother doesn't have to do chinuch for her sons? That's not fair. It says the first line, Iyachi afilu ishanami. So the answer, unfortunately, that some people may not like to hear is that when it comes to chinuch, at least in this specific situation, the mitzvah is on the father and the mitzvah isn't on the mother. Okay? So when you're learning this, the term chinuch doesn't seem appropriate over here. Because if you remember last week, we had the whole class on, right? The whole shir on Tuesday night was, well, is this good or is this not so good, right? The whole concept of taking upon yourself a nazirus. We had a lot of opinions that says this is not really the best thing. So you're telling me that of all the things you want to educate your son, you want to talk about nedarim and nazirus, and abstaining from things. Remember we said you're called a choteh. Remember the Gemara in Tainus said that if you don't eat, you're called a choteh. This is what you want to teach your son at age 11? To start being a radical, right? To stop drinking wine, to stop having fun, right? Is this what we want to have in store for our children? So this question, believe it or not, was asked by the Maratz Chayes. Maratz Chayes, the great Achron, my personal favorite, always asks the very, very sharp questions. I'm going to read it out loud. He says, Kashali, Kushya, he says, I got a big problem with this Gemara. Hine yadanu koach inyan hachinuch, Hainu laman shelo yeh hamitzvos al ha'adam lamasa. Let's understand what the term chinuch means. Why is it that we gradually educate children and tell them to do mitzvos when they're 10 or 9, 11, 12, so that when they come bar mitzvah, it doesn't appear like a humongous weight was dropped, right? Like when you're working out, your first day in the gym, right? You don't start bench pressing 420 pounds, right? You start off with 25 maybe, right? You don't go to 400. Why not? Because you're weak. And good luck lifting something 400 pounds, right, on your first day in the gym. So you start small, baby steps. That's the whole point of chinuch. Slowly and slowly, right? So, because if you could imagine that it starts right away when you're gadol, and you have to do nothing until you're 13. You could literally keep nothing until the night of your bar mitzvah, right? So, lachen hiskilu chazal l'chaneches aktanim b'mitzvos terem sheyagia l'klal chiyuv. So that's why there's this concept of do it slow, break them in, show them what a lulav is, show them what a Megillah is, bring tefillin home 6 months before the bar mitzvah so he knows how to tie it, and do all these kinds of things and teach him Hebrew and teach him Mishnah so that he knows what to do. That makes sense. L'man yakel alehem gam achar kach l'kaimam. Acharei she'od kodem hazman hayu murgolim behen. Let him get used to it. Okay? V'hinei adkan shaya chinuch rak ba'osan hamitzvos asher mo'alin chova ala adam. Yeah, but you pick mitzvos that are reasonable. That makes sense. Kigo mitzvah sukkah v'lulav aval inyan nedarim u'naziris asher enam chov ala adam lindo or lahazir. You don't have to become a Nazir. Yeah, the Gemara says there are certain cases where you had Yetzer Hara, you wanted to abstain. Great, Yashar Koyach. That's for 1 in 10,000. But the mainstream child growing up, that's not a chiyuv to have him become a Nazir. The Hare Adarabba. Amru Hanoda Kilu Bona Bama. We had this 3 times already, right? The famous Rav Nassan in the Darim, that if you become a Nazir by making a neder, it's like you build a bama. It's horrible. V'rak ha-mitzvos ha-tluyin ben nedarim and naziris klum hem arak b'tanai im hiktim lahem. He goes on and on. Hadavar b'neder or b'naziris. You have to start naziris by making a neder. V'kiven she'ein kan mitzvah hamutelos l'chova. This is not a mitzvah. So if it's not a mitzvah at the end of the day, ech nofel al zeh inyan chinuch. So then there's no chinuch if there's no mitzvah. So what is the Gemara hakin about chinuch? V'chi yitachen sheyichanech oso be'inyan acher shelo yavolo b'vadai ve'ez sheyigdol ve'efsher sheyavor kol shnaso v'lo yischayvu b'mitzvos hatluyin b'naziris. He says you could live your whole life and never be Mekayim in the mitzvah of naziris, and you could be just fine and dandy. You don't need it. This isn't like a sukkah or a lulav. Tzarich iyun gadol. He says, I don't understand. This is a big problem in the Gemara. Doesn't really give an answer. He does quote the Rush. Okay? In order to answer this question, you have to go back to the Gemara, and the Rush says 2 words. You know what the Rush says? I'm on Tav Chav Tes Amud Aleph, Kedei Lechancho b'mitzvos. The Naziros Siag Precious, because you know what Naziros is about at the end of the day? It's about separation, little by little. So maybe the message is, listen, you have the world is your oyster, right? What would you tell your child growing up, right? Have fun, the world's your oyster, everything's great. But you know what? Once in a while, just separate yourself. Don't go too crazy. So that's possibly the only way to explain this concept of chinuch, which we translate as educating, right? But again, you're only educating for mitzvos, but here the only possibility is that you're telling them that there may be times in life where you have to edge off a little bit and what we call build a fence around you and separate yourself. So there happens to be a discussion in Maseches Brachos whether the concept of chinuch, believe it or not, is the mitzvah on the son or the mitzvah on the father. So that's an interesting chakira. How do you look at chinuch? Meaning, the Gemara over here said it's the father, not the mother. But even though the son is not old enough yet, you could argue that he has a midrabanan, he's on a durabanan level. So the Gemara in Brachos, in one instance, says that Gemara talks about being motzei someone, right? So it says in the beginning of Maseches Brachos, Daf Chaf on page 20, that a katan can't be motzei a gadol in benching, for example, right? So there's a discussion on Daf Mem Ches, which says that someone who only ate a kazayas of dagon, right, of grain, can be motzi someone who has to bench from the Torah. So how is it that on Daf Chaf you can't, and on Daf Mem Ches you're allowed to? So Rashi over here says that on Daf Chaf we're talking about a katan, and a katan has no mitzvah at all, not even midrabanan. Why? Because it's all on the father. In the words of Rashi over here, he says, "The avuahu derami lechanuche." It has nothing to do with the son. The son is not even obliged on a durabanan level. The only obligation is on the father. Interesting over here, not to get into this topic, but Tosfos actually says it is on the son. He has a whole different interpretation of our Gemara and Brachos Daf Mem Ches, but the bottom line is that Tosfos believes that the mitzvah is on the son. Okay, and continuing, just one more note of our Gemara in Nazir, because the Gemara says, okay, it refers to the father but not the mother. Then the Gemara on the 1, 2, 3, on the fourth line says, Bishlam al Rabbi Yochanan damar halachi ben Nazir, amatulachi beno in bitolo. So, okay, if it's halacha l'Moshe Messinai, now we've been talking about the mom versus the dad. Not yet have we discussed son versus daughter. You know the Gemara was going to get into the daughter because, after all, we know that girls can become Nazirim also. So, El Reish Lakish, Afilu Bitu, according to Reish Lakish, who says this all has to do with chinuch, it sounds like there's chinuch on girls also, right? Obviously, we know it's a very hairy topic. What exactly the girl is mechuyeves to learn as opposed to the boy. But here's the Gemara's answer. Ksavar beno chayiv l'chancho, bito eno chayiv l'chancha. Girls are not, all the women out there, shut your ears. But if you have a 10, 11, 12-year, 9, 10, 11, right? A girl does not have the same obligation of chinuch as a boy. We're not going to talk about the famous tshuva of Rav Moshe, where he discusses about the Beis Yaakov, the whole Beis Yaakov movement. Someone asked him, if I have to give 10% of charity, can I, right? That's what we generally do, or at least that's generally what the halacha is my tuition for a girls' school considered charity? Meaning, is that considered education? Do girls have to get educated like boys have to? So we're not going to get into that tshuva now, but it's interesting tshuva. But the Gemara just made a point. Okay, let's look, and one final Tosfos on Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis. It's about 10 lines from the bottom on 28b. The end of the line says Beno in large letters, Beno in bitolo. The kach halachehi Beno deshayach b'mitzvos lekesheyagdil mutal al ha'av lechancho. Why is it better by a son? Because, well, when a son grows up, he's going to have, right, all these mitzvos. So therefore, the father has to teach him while he's young. Avo bitolo. But a girl, not. A girl isn't going to have all these mitzvos. Says Tosfos Tema, I have a problem. Hada Amar Ba'alma, that's a very famous Gemara we have at the end of Maseches Yevamos. that says katan ochel nevelos ein bizdin mitzuyin alav lahafrisho. Interesting. If Bezdin is walking by the streets and they see a boy eating something not kosher, or he's doing an avera, and he's 9 years old. So do we have a concept of chinuch and saying, no, you can't eat that, it's not kosher? So the Gemara actually says that if they see this happen, Bezdin does not have to separate the boy from the food. V'amar Rab Yochanan, v'amar Ribach, af lachan chol lasos mitzvah mutal ala av. Right? The Gemara over there says that what? That when it comes to chinuch, right? Even regarding chinuch, lasos mitzvah mutal ala av, it is, right? It is. So the Gemara, so Tosfos answers, Ve'eshlam b'chinuch lo shayach el azhir la'asos u'l'kayim mitzvah aval lihizar mila'av or ein zachinuch. So Tosfos makes a major distinction. To us, we would probably never think about this. How do you define chinuch? Chinuch, according to Tosfos, is always something positive, to teach the son something, a mitzvah. But when it comes to separating him from an avera, if he's stealing, because he's not a gadol yet, there's no inyan of chinuch to say, don't steal, don't eat non-kosher, don't lie, don't do something wrong on Shabbos. That is not considered chinuch. Very interesting. And if you look in the Rambam, when the Rambam talks about all of his various examples of chinuch, you'll see that this is true. When it comes to Yom Kippur, Katan ben Tesha Shanim, right? The question of a kid fasting. All right, a kid wants to fast on Yom Kippur when he's 10 years old. So what do? So what the Rambam calls mechanchen sola shows, right? You do it for several hours, right? You fast a third, you fast a quarter, you fast a half a day, right? You gradually, then you're 11, you do 2/3. When you're 12, you do 3/4, right? You do it gradually. So if he ate breakfast at 9 o'clock, have him eat breakfast at 10 o'clock, right? You do it gradually. By the way, Yom Kippur fasting, though, is that considered a negative or a positive thing? So I brought this as an example of a positive because the mitzvah is inui. It's an active prohibition. Do not eat. It's not a case of like eating something not kosher. When it comes to Yom Kippur, inui, and that's exactly what Tosfos says. If you go back to the Tosfos, kiyu mitzvah v'inisem, right? That fasting is something positive. It's not abstaining, right? It's something positive. You have to do inui. So that's called a positive chinuch versus a negative chinuch. So that's one example. The second example is Megillah, right? So I'm reading from the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah. He says, when it comes to reading the Megillah, so children should be trained to read it. You don't have to do it before you're 13, but you train them, and that's another example of chinuch. How about by Sukkah? I'm reading the laws of Sukkah and Lulav. The Rambam says, Katan she'eno tzarich le'imo shehu k'bein chamesh, k'bein sheish, chayev b'sukkah. Midivrei sofrim k'dei lechancho b'mitzvahs. What do you do with a child who's 5 years old? Do you let him eat inside? No. You let him eat in a sukkah so that by the time he's 13, he understands that this is the week that we eat outside in a sukkah, right? Like we said before, you don't just plop him in the middle when he's 13 and start telling him all these things. So all of these, when it comes to a shofar, right? And it comes to a lulav, right? Again, katan hayodel and aneya, as long as the katan knows how to shake a lulav, that's it. It's chayav in the mitzvahs. Talmud Torah, the same thing, right? You have to teach a kid, katan aviv chayav alam the Torah, even if he's lo bar mitzvah, right? Another example. Also, by comes to tefillin, the Rambam says in Hilchos Tefillin, katan sheyadeh lishmor tefilav, as long as the katan is understanding enough in guarding his tefillin that he doesn't leave it somewhere he's not supposed to. That's it. Aviv lokeach lo tefillin k'dei lachancho b'mitzvos. Another. So all these go back and forth to reiterate the point that Tosfos made, that when it comes to, right, that when it comes to chinuch, it is only something positive that you're instilling in the boy, and you're not separating him like the Gemara in Yevamos says. You see somebody not kosher, that's not chinuch. Now, that doesn't mean that you should encourage it. It just means that for that level of chinuch, it's something only that's positive, and not just abstaining from something from doing a lo taseh. So I thought that was just an interesting little tidbit on chinuch. Look at that, exactly 9 o'clock. On that note, questions, comments, critique? No. All right. I guess George is in here. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Bezalel.
Thank you.
Right.
You're welcome.